Hello Isaac, this is Majnu, and I've been analyzing the game that you sent me. It's a beautiful game, nice attacking chess against the French defense that your opponent played. And well, in the message that you sent me, you asked me to explain you a few things about this line against the French, and well, it goes actually too far to go too deep into opening theory in a video, because it would simply take too long. It's the French defense knows so much theory that it's impossible to cover everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to point out a few ideas that you can use in this variation, and I think that on this level that's the only thing that you need. You need to understand a few ideas to play against the French in this variation, and you don't need to go into detail into every sideline, because simply it's not a matter of memorizing an opening. What's important is to understand the possibilities to play the plans. Okay, so well, let's go through the game. You opened e4, your opponent e6, so we have this French defense, knight to c3, bishop to b4, and you play the far most popular move here, the move e5. Now your opponent plays a move that is not very usual. It's not a bad move at all. It has a plan, and that is the move queen to d7. Let me go back one move, because the most popular line here is to play c5. I'm sure that you have met this before, c5. Here normally white continues with a3, and there is a trade on c3, so white gets a double pawn, but you have the pair of bishops as a compensation, and knight goes to e7 mostly, and now the queen goes to g4, attacking g7. Here black can castle. Bishop to h6 is not really a big threat, because if you play bishop to h6, then there is knight to f5 to attack the bishop and defend g7. So bishop to h6 is not the thing to do here. Normally white simply continues, for example, with bishop to d3 here. As you can see, in this type of positions, the idea of white is to attack on the king side. This is the diagonals that are opened, and the queen on g4 is very important, and that's actually one thing that I want to advise you. I'll go back to the position where we left, that in this type of positions queen to g4 is an important move. It has to do with the fact that this bishop is not longer defending g7. Here actually the theory gives us different moves. There are different options, and one of them is queen to g4. You played a3, that's also a very popular move. Let's see how it went, because bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and now here your opponent played b6, and this is actually the moment to play now queen to g4. You also see what the idea is now of this queen to d7, this a bit strange move that your opponent played. The idea is to prepare actually against queen to g4, to be able to play f5 now, defending with the queen the pawn on g7. So if here f5, there are two options here. The most popular is go with the queen to g3 now, so you stay with the queen on this g file. And the good thing about this queen on the g file is that it's quite difficult for black to develop this knight on g8, because if the knight would go to e7, then g7 is undefended, and if the knight goes to h6, well, there could be a trade, bishop takes h6, giving black a double pawn there. So it's not easy for black to find a way to develop here. Theory continues. One of the lines is bishop to a6 here, and then there is a trade of this bishop. Bishop takes a6, knight takes a6, and then you continue developing with knight to e2. Your knight can find a way to f4, for example, later. So this is, let's say, a bit the main idea in this type of positions. The move queen to g4 is important. That's really something to remember, that when you meet the French and this dark squared bishop has gone to b4, then there is almost always a good moment to play queen to g4. Now let's return to the game. So b6, and you continue with bishop to d3. Of course, that's also a good move. I mean, it's a very natural way of developing your light square bishop, directing it to h7. Bishop to a6 now by your opponent, and here you play queen to e2. Well, again, I can repeat it, queen to g4 is still a good idea. By the way, instead of f5, answering g6 is also an option, but then the dark squares are being weakened a lot by black, so it's not a very nice structure for black to have, especially because it's missing his dark square bishop. So that about this. Let's continue with the game, because I think that queen to g4, the queen to g4 idea is not in your system, let's say your thinking system, so that's why you didn't perhaps consider it, and you were thinking about other ideas. So queen to e2 played. Now he took on d3, you retook with the pawn. Very logical idea to be able eventually to advance the c4 pawn also, and this pawn also protects these two important squares, e4 and c4. Now knight to c6 played by your opponent, and here you continue with knight to f3. So this closes the option of moving the queen to g4, and that means that now black can develop his knight to e7, since the g7 pawn is not vulnerable right now. You castle kingside, and then he plays h6. He was worried perhaps that one of your pieces would go to g5, and here you continue with a4. Actually, at this point, I'll just move back this last move. At this point, I see that you find a plan to move a4 and bishop a3, and then realize that this bishop is actually important to be used on the in the kingside attack. So you lose a bit of time by moving this a4, bishop a3, and then going back with the bishop to the kingside. Well, this happens in chess when we're playing over the board, and we have an idea, and then at a certain point we realize that, wait a minute, I need to do something else. If it's possible without any trouble to admit the mistake and return, is of course the good thing to do. And afterwards, when we analyze a game, we can see that it was not necessary to go with this a4 bishop a3 idea. You could have just stayed with this bishop on this diagonal right now, for example, by playing bishop to d2 first to connect the rooks, still staying with this bishop on this diagonal. Another idea is to play bishop to h4 followed by queen to g4. So let me show you. Bishop to h4. If your opponent castles here, there's queen to h4 threatening bishop takes h6. So here king to h7 is almost forced to defend against this threat. And now you can continue with, for example, f4 with the idea of playing f5 and starting a strong attack here on the king side. Now let's return to the game. So here a small sidestep, let's say, with a4, castle kingside, bishop to a3, rook to e8 to unpin the knight, and now you play a move with another idea. You realize that you need to focus on this h6 weakness, and your plan is interesting. Your plan is to play h3, knight to h2, knight to g4, bishop to c1, and then hit on h6 with a light piece. Good plan. It's a plan that's based on, let's say, characteristics of the position, and that's important in the way that you think this plan making, that you base it on the weaknesses of the opponent's position. So king to h7, bishop to c1, queen to e7, and now you go immediately with this sacrifice, bishop takes h6. Interesting sacrifice. It's I'll go back. There are of course other options. There is also an option to, let's say, build up the attack slowly by playing f4 here. Playing f4 with the idea of later perhaps queen to f3 and then f5 and attack that way. What you choose is to try to break the defense of the opponent immediately by damaging his pawn structure, especially because this f6 square is very important here. Now your opponent seems to have been a bit shocked by this sacrifice because he didn't accept it. He played f5 here, but let's have a short look at what would happen if he would have accepted this sacrifice. G takes h6. Now of course the knight can enter into f6, so knight to f6 check, king must move, and now you can continue with f4 and later f5. Another option is of course to grab the material immediately, but I don't think that's the best option. I think the best option is to play f4 here and continue the attack, but you also of course have the option of grabbing the rook. Oops, like this, and then a rook takes knight, and now continue with f4. And I think that you do have compensation here for this this sacrifice. You are, let's say you have a rook for 2 light pieces, but there is a damage on the defense of the opponent's king, so this does give you possibilities of continuing later with f5 and try to attack with the 2 rooks on the f file, for example. Instead of grabbing the rook, another attacking idea would be to play f4 immediately. Let's say that black wants to save his rook, so he goes with a rook to h8, and then you can continue with f5. The knight is under attack. If it takes on f5, rook takes f5, and you have strong attack here. Yes, you are a piece behind, but well, you did get some important pawns there, and the pawn on f7 is also can become a weakness, especially if you double up here on the f file. Later you can move the knight away. Perhaps also it's an idea to bring the queen also to the f file. Attacking chances, absolutely. So definitely a sacrifice that gives you opportunities. Let's continue with the game. He played f5 here, and you took en passant on f6, g takes f6, and now you saved your bishop to d2. Very good. So as a result, you have won these pawns on the king side. The king of black now is very vulnerable, and you have a perfect position here. Very good. He goes king to g7. You went with the rook now to e1. Good idea, since once more you show that you are thinking in terms of using the opponent's weaknesses. The e6 pawn is a weakness, so I'm very happy to see that you your plans in this game are based on the structures of your opponent's pawns. Now knight to a5 by your opponent, strange idea, but well, he wants to, it's only a simple threat here on b3, but he brings his knight very far away from where the action is going to happen. Queen to e3, threatening to enter on h6 with the queen. The king goes to f7, and here rook a to b1 to stop the threat of knight to b3. The knight goes back, so he lost a tempo there. And here you go queen to f3. You still have a wonderful position. I have been looking at entering with knight to h6 check here, and it does give you nice attacking chances. If knight to h6 check, the idea is that king to g7 is a mistake because of knight to f5 check. Forking king and queen, so he must take e takes f5, And now queen to h6 check, and the rook attacks the queen as well. So after the king moves, you can take this queen on e7. That means that after this check, like that, the king cannot go to g7, so he must go to f8. And if he goes to f8, then there is queen to g3, attacking the knight on g6. Queen to g7 would be a way to defend it, but then you can go knight to g4. With knight to g4 you threaten bishop to h6, winning the queen. So this would give you already very strong attacking chances by going knight to h6. The move that you made is not wrong at all. You still have a good position, you put more pressure on f6, and the option of giving this check on h6 is still there. He played knight to b8 here, trying to defend this f6 point by bringing his knight to d7, and now you gave this check on h6. Correct. The king went to f8, and here you had a different plan. Instead of going with the queen, for example, to g4 to attack the knight and have similar ideas as in the previous variation, you plan to advance your h-pawn. Of course, that's also a very strong threat. The knight goes to d7, and now you're playing queen to g4. The queen goes to g7. Now we don't have the retreat of this knight to threaten bishop to h6, but you do have rook takes e6, opening the position even more. Rook takes rook, queen takes rook, and now he takes the pawn on h4, threatens mate on g2, but you have queen takes d5, defending the pawn on g2 and winning actually more material each time. Rook to e8 was played by your opponent, and now you have this move knight to f5 is of course a good place for your knight, but it is traded here, and I was wondering if there was a better idea without trading this knight. And it's not very easy to find something. Perhaps something simple like bishop to f4, or chasing his knight away with well, that could be an idea, to play g3 and then try to bring the rook to the h file. That also could be an idea. Is there anything with knight to g4 and bishop to h6, sacrificing a second? Okay, this is very wild. Let's see if it works. My idea is to use the h6 square with this check. If it goes here, do we have a fatal attack with rook to e1 check? King goes there. Should we trade rooks, or no? We have here. That's it. Queen to a8, and it's all over. Alright, it needs to play knight to b8, sacrifice the knight to be able to place the queen in between, but now we take here on e8 and we win the queen. Whoa, this is wild, isn't it? Let's see again. So the idea is knight to g4. Now he doesn't need to take this knight. What if he doesn't? What's a good alternative? Let's say he tries to simplify the position to try to trade queens. Well, we still have this bishop to h6 idea is very strong. So king to e7, rook to e1 check, and then the same thing. So that means that this knight to g4 is a strong idea. You are threatening bishop to h6, so he needs to do something with the king or the queen. All right. Well, good to analyze these lines. You played knight to f5. you have the same threat, but with the difference that this knight can be traded, and that's what your opponent did. Knight takes knight, queen takes knight. It's still a good position for white, of course. Rook to e7, bishop to f4, attacking this pawn on c7. The knight went to b8. Now this black player here doesn't know what to do, what plan to make, and it is very difficult for black. It's just he's so under pressure. You give a check on c8, the rook goes to e8. Now you take the pawn on c7. One more pawn, and now the things are simplified here, and you get simply an endgame that is absolutely won for you. You have so much more material, 3 pawns up, and well, it's a matter of time. Just slowly you improve your position, and you won this endgame. Perhaps there was a faster way to win this, but it doesn't really matter, because in this type of positions you simply play slowly, improving a bit more without taking much risks, and you won the position. Here your opponent made a very serious mistake, by the way, by playing king to f6 and giving you an easy win with rook takes f5. If he wouldn't have done that, king to f6, let's say he waits by playing rook to f7, in this type of endgames it's a good idea to place the pieces on ideal squares. Now this bishop on f2 is not very well placed. It's a good idea to bring it, for example, to b4. On b4 this bishop would really control these important squares here and support the advance of this pawn. So for example here, bishop to e1, rook to f8 waiting, bishop to b4, rook to f7, and now advance the pawn with check. If king goes to f6 now, d6, threatening to take on f5, so he needs to play the king back to e6, and then you can start advancing the d pawn, the other pawn, to d4, later to d5, and this is just well, just as in the game, not difficult to win. Now let's have a quick look at the rest of the moves. Trading, simplifying, because you know that this endgame is totally won, and here at some point right there the notation stops and you write me on your message that you don't have the rest of the game, but that you won it quite easily. And well, excellent played, nice attack, a nice sacrifice on h6. As you see, in every game there are always points to improve and things to analyze, different lines that we could have found, but it's just something that when we are playing really behind the board we cannot see everything, and that's why it's good to analyze the games afterwards. Well, I hope you found this interesting, and I hope that you remember this queen to g4 idea in the lines of the French defense, where the bishop, I'll go to that moment, oops, there we are, in the lines where the bishop is gone from f8, there is queen to g4 is the idea to play with white. Is a strong strategy, let's say. And if you're really interested in researching some more of these lines, I would advise you to have a look in a book, in a theory book about the French defense, to have more weapons against it. Alright, thank you very much for watching and for sending me this second game, and I wish you all the best and see you next time. Goodbye.